it's used for educational purposes, people can stop on a given slide and the main points will be on hand. And I just wanted to point out that for the last 2 days, I've been sticking in these little numbers on the upper left-hand corner so that if you do have a question, it is possible to refer to a particular slide. So because we have an interdisciplinary audience, I just wanted to go over a few terms. We have people coming from different sectors, different ages, different abilities, or groups with different abilities of differently abled people that they're working with. There are artists of different disciplines, practicing artists, academics, scientists who are also artists, writers, dance people, and music people, storytellers, and probably all of us have a little activist stream in us. So people work in different ways, alone and teams and communities. So I wanted to just introduce some context or some languages. And so if you don't want to read, I mean, you don't have to read. I'm basically going to cover everything that you see in the texts. Not too many look like this. But anyhow, you can go straight to Wikipedia and look at social practice work. And it's a little bit, I think, larger than community arts practice, which is what some people might call this. And a lot of the research that I've done has fallen into this. It's an old name when we say community arts, but it really started in the cauldron of 70s activism. But anyway, social practice is what people are calling this now. So it focuses on the interaction between the audience, social systems, and artists through aesthetics and ethics. Ethics is a word you didn't even used to be able to say at art conferences because people would come back at you and say, oh, stop being so sentimental. But I'm glad that ethics is something that is used in the art world now. Collaboration, which many people are into, methodologies, media strategies, and again, activism comes up. So socially engaged art is not a movement or a style, and it's a way of defining a new social order. And I've really been presenting this to the stakeholders at Bruyère because I think that when we talk about arts and healthcare, we're talking about a social order. And I didn't really see it till I started working on bringing Bruyère into Culture Days and started to prepare this Zoom because I've been so busy working that I haven't really been doing the reflective part. I've just been moving based on my experience and on intuition. So as you can imagine, the end products are not commodities. They're processes for social change. From a medical lens or a medical point of view, this is a total quote from the main person who invited me, my main on-site, my main medical colleague, Dr. Carol Wiebe. This is straight from her mind. And I think it's a good way of understanding the population. I've been working mostly at St. Vincent, which is one of the sites of Bruyère, and it is complex care. So many patients there are hospitalized for months to years with minimal access to culture. Culture is kind of a loaded term, depending where you come from. I think sometimes it's like explaining water to a fish. Anyways, patients' days are focused on their medical issues and their inabilities. And their interaction with an artist in residence may be the first time a patient or their families or staff has the opportunity to discover creativity. That is a big part of what's happening in the 2 years that I've been there. So creative participation by the patients, and I really see this, and I hope you do too, shines the light on their abilities while they're in this position of everything paying attention to their inabilities and their pain. And I've really noticed how it affects the way the hospital staff perceives the patient. From a social change point of view, the best way I found to define it is this big print: culture as a determinant of health and health systems as a site of culture. And that is where I'm aiming. And that's where I hope that everybody who's working in arts and health, I hope that's a lens that you carry close to your heart. So this diagram at the bottom is from Suzanne Lacey, from a book she wrote, I think in '95. She's one of my art heroes. I've met her at conferences and spoken with her and read what she's done and been following her. She's really famous now. So I think in this diagram that comes out of a book, an old book now, In the middle, you might have talked about the artist and the stakeholders that got together to originate and take responsibility. Because really, when you're doing a collaborative project, while collaboration and stretching that and sharing copyright is really important, the artist who starts it off is really responsible for driving the ship. And I bet everybody who's done collaboration has wondered, oh my gosh, this is really hard at some point. So I like that they put origination right in there with responsibility at the center. So then there's collaboration and co-development, and then volunteers and performers. And performers, I think that means the actors, not as in theater, but those of us who do it, whether they are volunteers, whether they are stakeholders, whether they are family members, facilities management people, administrators who review the site. Then there's the media audience, which I think is what we are at this point. And then the audience of myth and memory. And considering this is a book that comes from 1995, I think we're working already on the mythic level. Also, I just want to draw attention to the word myth, because I think there's a lot of myths about who has access to art, art being with the capital A, the capital art world. And I think that myth is something that needs to be looked at or thought about. So my influences from science and art come from these people looking at their thinking. Ursula Franklin, who talks about the earthworm theory. She's a physicist and a famous watcher of social structures and technology. Evelyn Fox Keller, who wrote a really famous book on gender and science, but it's interesting because she talks about what is objective and what is chosen to be researched. And I'm interested in that kind of thinking because I think it's really interesting how the capital A art world will start to look at collaboration or placing artists for collaborative possibility, not here have this because I chose it, but what can we do together? What is chosen to be done and what is this kind of sacred objective? It's very, I'm kind of rereading her book and looking at my work through her lens now. Ellen Dissanayake, who was an ethologist and looks at the role of art in society. You might have heard her ideas from making special or the artification. And I thank Dawn Dale for showing me her book decades ago. Arlene Raven for her writing about art in the public interest. Suzanne Lacey, who keeps popping up in anybody's knowledge basket who's doing this kind of work. And Melanie Fernandez, who was one of the people who got the community art program running at the Ontario Arts Council. And I had the privilege of spending lots of hours with her sitting on juries in the 90s and early 2000s, and who now runs a program called Culture Shift and teaches at Centennial College, where there's a postgraduate course on community practice. So in the middle, we have a really interesting diagram from Suzanne Lacey. I'm not sure where you'll see yourself on this diagram, but I know that I've moved through all of them and I'm kind of hanging off the right side. So people have asked me, you know, they talk about healing and therapy when I go to do art in a hospital. But I would say anytime I'm doing art, I'm doing therapy on myself. So I don't come to this work as a therapist. And somebody called me an art therapist once, and I said, no, I'm an artist who's doing collaboration. My principal interests are access to culture or access to artistic process or to demythologizing, demystifying what art is. My other principal aim is placemaking and agency. So orientation. This is the St. Vincent Hospital. If you look at the map at the bottom, you can, oh, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. If you look at the map at the bottom, you can see that it's not far from the Pimisi station. And this view right here is what you see if you're coming from the Quebec side, where I live in Wakefield. So we are just one block west of Bronson, and here's Somerset here. Good luck finding a parking spot anywhere around there. So I want to point out the hospital, which has gone through several enlargements and additions, and this lovely, massive skylight right here, which if we jump over to here, shines down into a 5-story atrium. This is the public square for many people who have to live in the hospital. If they leave the hospital, many people have to live there or else they cannot continue living. When you come to be a volunteer, or in my case, work as an artist in residence, you take a 4-hour orientation course from a therapeutic support services, and you get free pizza. And one of the things that I wrote down and love to remind myself is that St. Vincent is one of Ottawa's best kept secrets. When you walk in, it is almost overwhelming. There is, I originally came into this hospital to visit a friend who had just had a double lung transplant, a very respected fellow from Wakefield, who we all miss dearly. Anyways, this is the inside view of the 5-story atrium when you come in from the parking lot entrance, which is now the screening entrance. There is this massive stairwell, which features a lot in the residency projects. These are typical views of the hallway. And in the beginning, I used to be quite weirded out by all the equipment, the people attached to the equipment attached to people, tubes going in and out of people. Now, I must tell you, I don't even see anything. I just see these beautiful spirits. And yeah, so in terms of the orientation for that space, there's the spatial, the whole massive size of it, the floors. I get lost a lot. The medical orientation, like any of my projects, whether it was with the Italian community or 6 years working with the law people or with the feminist law community or projects that I do with Wakefield, there are massive learning curves, especially for the people who become deeply involved in the art process, who are non-artists. So the learning curve is a two-way thing. In this case, the medical is the big learning curve for me, using the right words. The human orientation, the different kinds of people that are completely there mentally, but trapped in a body that isn't doing what they want to do, or people who have very good use of their arms and hands, but there's something, something that's happened inside their brain. Working in this way, like working on anything deep, there's an emotional orientation. And I'm happy that I'm an older person, because I don't know how strong I would have been in my 30s to do this. And then there's the ethical orientation. There is a mentee and a younger artist that I've been talking with who I had to have really serious discussions with in terms of permission. An artist has to have consent to show pictures. So the pictures that I'm showing you are all grace of the people who are at the hospital, the patients who have given permission for me to show their pictures. So as I said before, some citizens have to live on site. That's the only way they can physically survive. So they leave behind a world of live art if they've been interested in art. They leave behind stories being told to them. Many of them who can't use their limbs anymore can't hold up a book or turn the pages. They leave beside having access to live music or not really being able to hear the kind of music they want to hear because they don't have their sound system. Movement is an issue, and goodness making is something they don't get a lot of chances to do. So I don't know if you know this person, Kat Holmes. She's written this incredible book called Mismatch. And she talks about this is the way that we exclude people. So if you think of most people who go into museums or who are interested in art or who can go into art stores, they live here. And then there's some people who maybe aren't interested in art. And then there's some people who can't even get to these places. So we can look at disability not as really as a personal health condition, but we can look at it as mismatched human interactions. Why can't the wheelchair get up on the sidewalk? Why doesn't this door open, you know? So I'm done a lot of public art. I have no legacy issues. What I got from doing these large scale public art projects where I invited non-artists in was really looking at what art is in people's lives and what we make and how it relates to their public lives and public space. So this is a diagram that I took a screen capture from Kat Holmes's video. And I have dropped in here in the middle. What can an artist's social practice become in this reality? So conceiving, I approach everything collaboratively, and I started to conceive Molly. I could go back to the first slide and say that in every community project, there's one or two, usually one person who takes on this loaded responsibility that introduces you to the inner workings of the site, and they're there and they answer you and they understand what your questions are. Well, for me, Molly Knox is this person. So Molly has been living in a wheelchair for 15, maybe 16 years now. I met her maybe a month after I was there. I knocked on her door. I never go into anybody's room without asking, because that is their world, the room that they live in. You can see from her room, which is like most patients' room, there is not much stuff to put places. So we were talking about where can the art be? What kind of art can we make one day? And she was telling me about this dream she had to paint on the garden benches that some of the more able-bodied patients had done. And she was always trying to make these cherry blossoms, but how could she get to the benches? So she has a pretty cultural upbringing. We actually have a kind of imagined video project together. But anyways, at that point, we started talking about Matisse and his long sticks. And did you know that Matisse called his workshop apartment the factory? So he predated Andy Warhol by a very long time. And Molly and I always joke about the fact that he had a whole crew of people that he could ask to do this and do that. And I'm really Molly's own crew of people that can do stuff, and her volunteer that you will soon see. So I was so inspired by her that I went home and I brought in a piece of, I brought in some variations of dowels or things that I have at home. And the weight seemed to be okay with her. And her favorite color at the time was yellow. So I went home and I made this quiver of different, you can see that they're 44 inches long or 60 inches long. And I brought this in and we started doing experiments with the Matisse brushes. So it turned out that, well, we thought this was just going to be great. And we were just going to start off on these, brought in all these sheets of paper to wrap around a piece of foam core. And we set this up and, well, it didn't work. So plan B, they were much too heavy once the tools were on the end of them. So I started to set up these little doodads. It was a clip that was supposed to hold an iPad, I think. So I ran back to her room. I'm in the family room at this point. There's some people having a visit over on the side. And we set up this little doodad here to hold her stick and try different tools, markers, and brushes and paint. And it just wasn't working, because now what happened when we had this is that all the strokes became kind of a concave. And when I was discussing this with Dr. Weeb, she said, oh, I know a place in, I can't remember where, but she said, oh, I know there's a place where everybody throws their old satellite dishes. So in the back of my mind with Molly, I have an idea that we're going to find some of these old satellite dishes. And with these kind of strokes that are, concave, well, the stroke is convex, but the surface would have to be concave. We could make this very cool sort of low relief down a hallway somewhere. Anyways, Molly came up with the idea that we should start working with a holder that was like what some people have to use to hold on to their eating utensils. So we ran off in search of her PT, and lo and behold, there was her occupational therapist, and we found her in the hall. So that was a great conversation. So then we made, why isn't this turning? Yeah. So then, just a minute, are we here? Yeah. Okay. So then another conversation that was going on at the same time was, if we were going to make a project, what would be? And because I come from large scale projects, and because I think there's a lot of really, well, everybody, all the patients say this to me all the time. There's this really crummy art in the halls here. A lot of it is really faded and really awful, and it is time for a renewal. Anyways, I brought back pictures and ideas of large scale work, photos that I took at the Art Gallery of Ontario that summer. And I started showing these around. And so we talked about the idea of bringing color is really important, and large relevant imagery to the hospital environment. And a lot of my previous projects and a lot of my work with people, period, has to do with identity and belonging. So it was very natural for me to talk about, could patients be the subject of the art? There is no art that has the kind of people who are the axis of why the architecture and the hospital exists. They are the reason the hospital exists, yet there's nothing that reflects their presence in terms of the artwork. So that was a point in the discussion. That was an axis point where things started to change. There was a motivation to involve families and expand engagement. I'd done a presentation to the Patient Family and Advisory Council. And then I found out from Molly that her two sisters were coming, one from the East Coast and one from the West Coast. So we had like 6 weeks to pull this together. 6 weeks is not a long time when you're working in an organization. So finally, I made this little hand paintbrush holder. Okay, now we're not painting at a distance, but hey, let's make a mural. It's going to happen on a wall. So I made that at home based on some of the occupational therapy holders I'd made. And I brought it back and tested it with Molly. So now the pilot projects begin, and we had to, excuse me, I'm just going to move this down here. I would like to move that to the bottom of my screen. Okay, so now the pilot project began, and it was very much like a site analysis approach for a public art project. Molly and I spent an afternoon rolling around the hospital, looking at all the floors. There are these beautiful curved walls. Of course, we like this one that's on the 5th floor, but we couldn't have that. So we started doing like a site analysis and taking pictures and talked about what would need to be moved if we were going to do this big project on a big wall. This is a typical lobby when you come out of the elevators on each floor. On the 1st floor, there's something like that as well. Just a note to the future, this is an idea. These would make great galleries. So Dr. Wiebe and I have been talking about that. Next, please. Yeah, so I started to make concept sketches. This image on the left, I actually was looking at artist residencies in Mexico, and I happened to find this on a wall somewhere. And I mean, I think all of us know what it's like to trace your child or trace a friend on a piece of paper. So I just used that as a jump off point. And I started to talk about how the people in the hospital, the patients or the staff, were like different energy. They carry different energies, and or people would have favorite colors, or we could think of them as different energy forms. And when they overlapped through their interactions during the day, they would create new energy. So there would be new colors that would be created. Somewhere along the lines, I found these pictures of Oliver Eliasson's light projections. So I kind of made like a little, in the public art world, we'd call that a maquette or a presentation package. And I started to show this around and get ideas. So if you want to get a public art job, you have to get, have a prototype and you have to select the site. So somewhere along in here, there should be something about going around with the, oh yes, here we go, sorry. We had to, this all required a review by the administration, the main stakeholders, and the facility management. When I first started the job, someone who was working there said to me, I don't think you'll ever be able to work on the walls. And that's actually all I wanted to do, was work on the walls. So just so you know, things that aren't supposed to happen can happen if you stick with it. So we were given permission to do this on the 5th floor across from the nurses station on 5 South. And this is what it looked like before. And there were these railings. So these information and social boards needed to be relocated, which takes some planning. And then these railings had to be removed. So I thought that the color charts that people put out were not very patient-centered. So I'm not really a digital person, but I'm learning to be. So I guessed my way through this and then made this color chart. And there's a whole paint store in St. Vincent, which I think is fantastic. If you end up in a facility that has a paint store and a print shop, I think you've hit gold. So Molly's sisters arrived. One of them is actually a professional artist. And we did this on the wall. And the whole time we're doing it, we're thinking, we need a vertical, like Molly was supposed to be the only test. But I'm looking at it and I'm like convincing everybody, we need a vertical element. We need something tall to change this composition. So lo and behold, the assistive technologist, Bokar, walks around the corner. We beg him to stand against the wall and trace him. And now we've got new content. So there, of course, he didn't have time to paint. Molly's sister, Susan, painted. So we pushed this test project a little bit more because Molly, after a few days, decided that the two people in the middle needed a friend. And she suggested somebody who lived on the same floor, Larry Dubreuil. Larry's parents, Mark and Faye, are these amazing volunteers. So you can tell what's happening here. We continued to extend the project, played more with the overlap of color. Everybody knew the railings were going to go back up. When it was all finished, and lots of people came around while we were painting, you have to bear in mind the point from which you're looking is where the nurses' station is. So it's a very busy area, lots of comments, lots of feedback, things changing. Anyways, everybody loved what was there. Then the railings went back up. Uh-oh, that was a problem. So letters flew back and forth from the families to the administration, to the facilities management. People were concerned. It's actually interesting on a symbolic level that, as Linda reminded me, that the railings actually push back the people and hold them back. So the people who were in the mural didn't like the way it looked at all. So I went in and we had lots of talks, and I finally realized that one of the things that was off was that now that the railings were back up and the people were human sized, there seemed to be, this picture actually goes much taller. There seemed to be a heck of a lot of space at the top that was so empty that it kind of diminished the people at the bottom. So what I played up this idea to show them a sky, and then in a very quick way put in this sky. This took about 2 hours to do with clear and opaque paint. So that was easy to lay in and everybody loved it. But the thing that happened when I put up the sky, you would not believe, I must have had 55 conversations with people about people feeling like they would come and they would just go, oh, I can feel the outdoors. Oh, I feel like I'm going outside. I never get to go outside. So this whole thing about being outside, I mean, I just put the sky there as an artistic element once I checked it out with all the people. But that was such a massive learning curve for me. So I just want to talk about this because some people are afraid to go into collaborative projects because they think they have to have them figured out. But so many of the answers happen as the project is unfolding. And I wanted to show you here the mural in relation to the other stuff that's going on, because when you're doing the mural and you're so involved in it, you think it's everything. But in the end, it's just one small part of this massive operation and of hundreds of people's lives. And I'm always interested in the macro and the micro point of view of what we do as work and how we can touch people. So the communications department came in at this point and they took some of the documentary pictures and they framed them, and there's an explanatory panel as well. And we hadn't really announced the residency. By this point we are in, well, summer weather. So I've been there, it's almost a year since I've been talking with Dr. Wiebe and Dr. Sveistrup about what the artist in residency could be. And this was our first kind of public presentation about it. And I think if you look back at the painting, you can see these paper faces that are taped to the wall. So right here, what I'm doing is sharing, you don't have to read all this. What I'm just sharing with you how these were really fun things to do. So I'm sharing with you how the patients got into it right from the beginning, very happy to sit for a side portrait. And then I would measure them. Then I took it home, scaled it up. That was probably the longest part of this, scaled it up on my computer, put tracing paper over my computer, and then traced till I got these perfect profiles. And then when it came time to do the murals, there were all these perfect profiles. And when once the patient's bodies were drawn with the Matisse sticks, they did turn out to be very functional. The patient and I would stand back and we would take a few minutes to talk about where the face was placed on the traced body. So the body and the assistive device, the chair or whatever, would be traced first up to the shoulders and the neck. And then the patient would be back, and then I would tape the head in different positions. And it would be like, should the head be higher? Should it be lower? Is it in the wrong place? So those are really collaborative and creative moments. So I just back up here. Once the mural was done once this mural was finished and people started to learn about it, more people started to see that there was visual and symbolic worth to the patient forms and that they were valuable and interesting artistic content. And more people believe that they could actually do it. And you can just see it in people's eyes. So if you start to think of that concentric circle diagram that I showed you that Suzanne Lacey made, you start to think about like a pebble dropping in the water. There are like these rings of belief that grow from the chance takers who started in the middle. So we were approved by the hospital, the facilities management, and the major administrators to do something on the first floor. And this would happen during the hospital's big life-changing day. So this mock-up that you see here is about the 25th version that I made, as people either said, I'll do it, or I won't do it, or my favorite color is this, or my favorite color is that. So finally I got a mock-up. And any signage that was on the wall in that lobby had to be moved. And then the paint dates were set with the patients. And we posted the mock-up on the wall. You can see the mock-up right there about a week before, so that people that knew what was coming. And then the experienced artists in the project, who were Molly and Larry's parents, we started 2 days before the big life-changing event to get something on the wall, so that when the life-changing event you'll come to see soon has hundreds of people going through the hospital. So we couldn't get it all done in one day, but we wanted the people who were participating to see what they were buying into, so to speak. So during the life-changing day event, which looked like this setup started at about 7 o'clock in the morning. This painting went on all day and the next day actually. And you can see that all kinds of people participated. If you don't see the people's faces, it's because they left before I could get their consent. But I wanted to show you how many different people of different conditions and abilities participated. This fellow here is the pharmacist. He is the tallest man in the building. And so in between this is a radio fundraiser, but CTV came in a couple times during the day, and they were doing interviews with all kinds of people. The famous Henry Burris, is that it, the football player? And Janet Wainwright and I were painting, and you'd be right in the middle, your flow would be going, and then someone would come up to you and say, 5 minutes till the interview. And it's like, change headspace. And I thought this was an interesting picture to include, because everything goes on in the hospital at the same time. So here I was having a discussion with the 3 key players and designers, and then this happened in the back. So there are heavy moments all the time. And I'm just showing you this because this is how many people were still at the hospital at 8:30 on that same day. It's an amazing community of people to work with, and it's really an honor for me. So when the project's finished, this is the kind of stuff that ends up on the halls. People finally start looking at what the key idea was, which is how people are different energy fields or different colors. And when they get together, things happen. So new colors are made. Another thing that happens, so these kind of discussions start to happen now. Another thing that happens is patients and caregivers and staff continue to see it in a completely different way. And they continue to say, I can't believe the patients did that, because that might have been their day off while it was happening. Or they'll say things like, I come into the main entryway and there's this big glass elevator and they see it through the elevator. So these are just some of their comments. I can't believe how the color changes the way I feel. Did you do this for LGBTQ people here at the hospital? I can see it from the minute I walk in, and it changes the way I see it through the elevators. People have referred to the yellow as a sacred color. People never knew that overlapping colors would do that. What do you mean you did that with patients? I get that a lot. I say, well, I started it, but the patients filled it in, or the patients decided how it would look, or the patients changed their color because they knew this color was missing and they wanted to be beside that person. So all these really beautiful discussions come out of that. The mural keeps the conversation going when the people aren't there. That's a big thing that the patients have said. And again, the sky lets me feel outside, which is really touching to me. People talk about mark making, the mark making that was the common denominator in everybody's approach. And when COVID came, a lot of discussions about who owns the rainbow. So it's winter, I go away. I come back, I quarantine. So I'm invited back to do something for National Nursing Week, which is in May. So I go at the end of April. And I start to design a merci thanks that has capacity for a lot of different skills and abilities to participate. At this point, my whole work framework changes, because whereas before I was kind of floating around people's rooms or doing stuff in the hallways, now I'm given a studio space to work in. I can leave stuff on the tables, anything that's in process. And I'm working one-on-one with patients in 1 hour blocks that include cleanup. And I think that's really interesting because, well, you know, groups can be served by a storyteller or a musical performance or watching dance. I really think that a lot is very beneficial in arts if you can spend time, especially with people who need physical help getting the tools into their hands. So I had been keeping my kids' blocks for 33 years, and I finally used them with by cutting up with a coroplast and cutting up a camping mat and made these stamps. And then I cut out the letters that you see here. They're 2 feet tall, and the people used the stamps, and we got into these really interesting discussions, you know, about space and pattern. Here finally was a chance to make those cherry blossoms that Molly had wanted to make. People with limited capacity to follow directions were making just dots or things. But then when I saw the similarity to the Australian dot patterns, we then spent part of a whole session, maybe 40 minutes, looking at Australian Aboriginal art. So the project kind of moves between hands-on making stuff in the studio or doing research on the internet. I'm very happy to have a computer in that studio. And sometimes the same direction gets handled differently from 1 minute to the next. So these were all interesting things, but then people start to see that something like dots and scrapes can be art making. So we start to have discussions about mark making and what is really art and who's making art, and people could work on each other's projects. And I wrote up here, music, every session is accompanied by music, morphine, pain, and time, because I'll get to the morphine later. This is, there's that stairwell that it's very hard to photograph the whole installation because it's so bright, but just go back here. These are close-ups of them. Cupcakes, because when you were celebrating the nurses, there could not be a shared cake. So cupcakes became part of the iconography for this. People absolutely love them. I thought it would only be up for a couple weeks, but it is still up. Patients and staff would come running to me when I would come in at different times of the day and go, "You can't believe what it looked like at noon. The light was so different than at 3 o'clock. So people are now coming to me talking about the effect of light on the art. And I draw your attention to this piece in the middle that the patient did not believe was a piece of art. Yet when she saw it amongst all the other patterns, she started to receive compliments from people. It was just belief making for her that she actually could be an art maker. So I have 3 mentees that I'm working with. One is Ksenia that you met before. And this is the kind of project that we're working with, making these mobility markers. So these are about the size of your hand. They are supposed to be encouragement icons down the hall. This is how big they are. And a lot of them are folded or curling and fading. And when patients are rolling along after losing a leg or recovering from a stroke or having been in a car accident or learning how to use a walker because they've just had a heart attack or they fell, they are supposed to be encouraged to walk down the hall. So 5 meters is something for somebody. Before you leave, you might be walking 140 meters. So these are going to be industrial. If COVID ever stops and we can go into the hospital, Ksenia and I have designed this project that's going to be very interactive and fun. So this is just an example of something she does, but it is not what's going to be on the walls. So then the atrium became a really good site. The Thanks Merci project showed us what a joy it was to do these projects and put them up in public space. So I brought in all these different materials and we started to make these, I called them the Star Trek flowers. Other people called them the psychedelic. Oh, they had all kinds of names. But anyways, they involved music and memory. Again, this idea of the outside and what a sacred space the garden was. So people could be painting, they were making sculpture. You'll see how large they are. They were manipulating tools, textures, and materials. I will tell you that these are actually the tops from takeout food. You can buy them by the hundreds. There's silver on one side and you can paint the other side. These were recycled jewelry that we found way in the back of the tool cabinet. And this is a very, very expensive pump. So a patient can give themselves morphine because they are in unbearable pain. And this is a patient who always shows up on time for the art session. And I am blown away. And at the end of every flower making, when every session is finished, we have a ritual. And the ritual is, oops, I'll get to the ritual. So these are the kind of discussions that come up with people in the making of the flowers. There's this agency. They imagine beyond anything they had ever done before. They start to have questions about, okay, well, I made that before, but I don't really think that I want to specifically make a buttercup now. I can't remember what a buttercup looks like because it's now May and there are no buttercups. So we go online, we start having these discussions about what would be the best tools, pieces of sponge or pieces of, different things to make the centers. This is a fellow who has very big amount, cannot remember anything from minute to minute. So I started to realize that I would have to give him repetitive tasks. So his whole estimation of what he was capable of doing, including his capacity to learn, blossomed throughout this, no pun intended, blossomed throughout this project. I would say his memory improved. We started to have really good discussions about his childhood, things he had done, other ways that he used his hands and his muscles when he was a stronger man. And he had this plant in his room, which was really healthy. And it was his idea to make these. And so I could see that these multiple repeated lines were something that really served the project. And we tied them to the tree grates that were in the 5-story atrium. Well, great reactions from everybody. So I wrote in very faint writing here, what we leave, what we take, the marks we make. For a lot of people that are going home after 13 months, 18 months in the hospital, recovering from something that completely sidelined them from the normal life they were living, the idea of taking one of these home is just a blessing to them. And this woman, Ghislaine, was just thrilled. And we spent the whole last session talking about where she would put it and how we would hang it. And that's why this one can actually hang on a wall. They weigh about an ounce. So here is the ritual. At the end of every flower making, we decide which is the best way to tuck the flower into the wheelchair, and we wheel on down to the elevator, sometimes in groups, sometimes with somebody joining us. And we go down and choose a site. The patient chooses the site where they're going to put the flowers, and then they usually hold it up while I tie it on in a few places. An interesting thing started to happen. Amos, who's working on his PhD in public health, and Serena, who had just finished her master's in memory and aging. These people were working, their research was stopped for a bit because of a shutdown. And so they were working at the screening table. So they became really, really interested in the project. Serena had so much initiative that she actually wrote the comms. Where's my Serena? She wrote the communications department when she saw my pictures of what was going on in the studio. And she asked them if they could make a slideshow on, there are monitors all over the hospital. So now there are actually pictures of the patients making their projects in the studio that everybody can see. And then a wonderful thing, besides these relationships that are growing between the staff and the patients, is that the patients get to see the support workers or the volunteers showing their art projects to other people. So conversations are growing in a lot of ways, things that I hadn't expected. So my learning curve is really, really growing. This is simply a composite that I made for culture days. Mime nodding to the volunteers. This is Signe, the magnificent Schneider, who I met through Molly and has helped me, was one of the main players to make the Culture Days project happen. This is Molly's driftwood from Monet's water lily pond, which should be in the hospital, but before I could get it there, after putting the hanging device on it, the hospital was closed to visitors. So I have not been in the hospital since maybe September 20th, and this is now waiting to be installed. This is the page you will find if you go to the Culture Days site. This is the hub page. You just have to type in "Be Moved by Art at Bruyère," and all these 4 events show up. These are, they weren't collaborations with patients, but the idea was conceived by the activities coordinator at Résidence Saint-Louis in Orleans. She had this idea of these kind of rainbow-esque 2-meter markers. I sort of stretched what rainbow meant and made these spacey 2-meter distance dots. And that redefines what 2-meter markers can be. And then this was Signe's idea that, let me see, bedside, people that were bedbound could actually look at a tablet and they could get a whole tour of the art that was in the hospital. And together we curated 20 pieces or 30 pieces for a walk and roll art tour, which is sort of like an on-site studio tour, but it's again something that patients and families can do when they get there. And then this is the last project. Every hospital at long-term care and long-term care place needs at least 1 gallery, if not more. So Dr. Wiebe and I are conspiring to make galleries in the hospital. So this was kind of like the prototype gallery, much like the mural on 5S was a prototype mural. This is something I've been walking by for almost 2 years and nothing is going on in it. So I suggested to Dr. Wiebe that we re that and turn it into a gallery. So I got permission from the powers that be. Facilities management helped give us new lights. It's funny because I'd just been having a conversation with Don Monet and he talked to me about when he set up his gallery, the Fritzie Gallery at GCTC, how lights were a big issue. And so these are the people that were in the show. Scott, who often is up all night and goes around and does architectural photography. That's Heikel, who's a security guard who was raving about the artwork in the murals. So finally one day I said to him, "You're an artist at home, aren't you?" And he goes, "Oh, no, I don't make art." He goes, "I take pictures." Well, you'll see the photographs he takes. They're amazing. Alan, a great ally in the project. His wife is in the hospital and he's on the patient family advisory committee. And then this is Adrian Kiva, who is a young person who works at COMS, who just finished a biology degree. And this is their work. I'm showing it to you in this form because there's a print shop in Bruyère and these were all printed. And this would be the type, when I was putting the show together, I ran this layout by all the participants and I had great discussions with Lisa in the print shop. And so just going about getting the work of the photographers printed becomes yet again another co-creative process. And this is Heikel's work. He started doing photography. Well, you can learn out all about this if you go to the Culture Days site. I won't tell the stories here, but they're really, really powerful photographs and they really change the look of the screening entrance. So while you're standing 2 meters apart, waiting to get screened before you go into the hospital, this is what you can see. I put this in as a little bit of art history. Talking with Dr. Wiebe and Sveistrup at the beginning of the project, and as the project has developed, these are the things that I envision now for what would be a sustainable artist in residence program. So orientation, I covered that. I'm going to make an orientation paper, but just understanding all the levels that orientation affects. Mentoring the new artists in residences, new art forms by serious practitioners. So whether they're storytellers, dance artists, makers, not arts and craft type stuff by volunteers. That was one of the comments from a study that came out. A flow of creative info and strategies that moves between healthcare sites and different centers. Models for, this is something I dearly would like to do, and it's been suggested to me by somebody at Carleton that it could be a PhD program. Develop a model for curatorial collaboration as placemaking and community wellness. If you're interested in that, or doing your PhD or your master's on that, I would be happy to be the on-site person. And I think this could be a model that all long-term care sites and hospitals could use. More galleries, bring in more exhibits for people who cannot go out. Move the exhibits from one wing to another. Don't leave them there. Art schools, public art program, this is big. Art schools, public art programs, and galleries recognize that the people who are in hospitals are citizens, and that there are silos that prevent these citizens from having access to art. There are even silos in the writing community about who writes about this stuff, this kind of a practice. So another thing that in a perfect project, past artists in residence would do a second term on a self-directed contemporary art project. In my mind, the art project would then, I'm thinking about something that turns into a public projection in public space. And so I'll leave you with my bottom line and my bottom goals again, which is culture as a determinant of health and health system as a site of culture. There was research. This on the right is our poster that we put up to invite people into a research study. And I'm hoping that if Lisa is here, Elisa Sheehy, who's a PhD and a physiotherapist and who was the lead researcher on that project, might talk to you a bit about how a medical study comes about. The main comments were, and these were all anonymous. I mean, I did help to feed information to this study about what I was doing and what suitable questions or approaches might be, and gave them information. But all of the study was done by the medical people, and by this, at one point I just backed away from it and had to stay far away from it. When the information came out, it was all anonymous. Main points were the need for professional practicing contemporary artists versus arts and craft volunteers. They appreciated that the level of conversation was not only creative and educational and technical, but also intellectual. They like being spoken to on intellectual levels, which is not something they get a lot of at the hospital from the staff who are taking care of their medical needs. They wanted an artist who was outgoing, welcoming, and positive, not a brooding artist. Maybe that's a myth, but I thought that was interesting that it came up in the comments. They love the experience of going into the working studio, just the place, entering that different kind of space where stuff was left out. It was a whole other physical space that welcomed the imaginary world and supported their own creativity. And again, that doing art allowed others to see them as more than their disease or disability. Language that can be understood. Anyways, the study at this point is 10,000 words. And I am hoping that it'll be disseminated through, well, it's going to be disseminated through journals, but I also think that it should hit street level arts and just general news. I want to thank very much these people, Petra and Renee, Bruyère and its various funding forms who have kept me going for 2 years, the Ontario Trillium Foundation who paid the last year, Arts Network, who have supported the mentorship program, Signe, the amazing volunteer, Megan and Samuel from Culture Days, and Linda, who have left us online. I'm off.